She had rope burns on her wrists and blood on her boots, and not one person in that town would look her in the eye. 17 years old, dragged through the dust of Black Hollow like something to be discarded. They called her a thief. They spat at her feet. They took everything she had and then had the nerve to call it justice. But one man rode out of the tree line that morning and did something nobody expected. He took her home. Not because she was innocent, not because he knew her, because something in the way she held her chin up, even with her hands bound, told him the story wasn't over yet. If you've ever been written off by people who never bothered to learn your name, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The trouble with Black Hollow was that it had a long memory and a short conscience. It was the kind of town that could turn on you between breakfast and supper and never lose a single night of sleep over it. The buildings along the main strip were sun-bleached and wind-scoured, the kind of weather that suggested the whole place had given up trying to look decent sometime around 1867 and hadn't reconsidered since. There was a saloon with a broken shutter that clapped against the frame every time the wind came through the canyon. There was a land office run by a man named Aldous Pruitt who wore a gold ring on every finger and smiled like he was calculating something every time he opened his mouth. There was a sheriff's office, technically. The sheriff inside it, a man named Roy Deeks, was technically present most of the time, technically awake, and technically in charge. But Black Hollow ran on something older than law. It ran on who had land, who had money, and who those people decided mattered. On the morning of September 3rd, Mara Vane was 17 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of stubborn bone and lean muscle, with dark eyes that took everything in without blinking, and a mouth that hadn't smiled in so long she'd nearly forgotten the shape of it. She'd been sleeping in the hayloft of Clement Greer's stable for 11 days, which was 9 days longer than Clement Greer knew about. She paid for her place in the straw by mucking stalls before dawn and staying invisible during the day, which had been working fine until it wasn't. What stopped it working was Marcus Holden. Marcus Holden was 26, the younger son of Silas Holden, who owned the Crossed H Ranch and approximately 40% of the grazing land in the valley. Marcus had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience. He rode with 2 friends who weren't quite friends so much as they were men who found it profitable to be near someone with money, and the 3 of them came into Clement's stable that morning looking for a horse that one of them had left there for shoeing. Mara heard them before she saw them. She pressed herself flat in the hay, slow and still, the way she'd learned to go still when something dangerous got close. She could hear Marcus talking, that loose, loud voice of his, the one that never had any doubt in it. "Telling you, Hep, if my father finds out about the Ridley shipment, he's going to lose his mind." A pause. Something dropped. A boot scraped the dirt floor below. What the hell was that? Mara knew before she knew. Her body went cold and certain. Someone's up there. She was on her feet before Marcus Holden's head appeared over the edge of the hayloft ladder. She had maybe half a second to think about it, jump or face, and she jumped, catching the rope that hung from the center beam and swinging herself toward the back wall, dropping to the ground in a way that hurt her ankles but didn't stop her. She ran. She made it 40 yards, maybe 50, before one of Marcus's friends got a horse between her and the street. She cut right, hit a fence post with her shoulder, bounced off it, and then Marcus himself came around the corner of the stable yard and grabbed her by the back of her coat. "There you are," he said. Not angry yet. Something worse. Satisfied. She didn't say anything. "You been sleeping in Greer's stable?" She kept her jaw tight. He searched her coat without asking, found the small leather pouch she kept tucked inside the lining. He opened it and looked at what was inside. A few coins, a folded piece of paper, and a thin silver chain with a broken clasp. Marcus Holden looked at the chain for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "This belongs to my mother," he said. It didn't. She knew it didn't, and he almost certainly knew it didn't either, but what mattered wasn't what was true. What mattered was what Marcus Holden said in front of witnesses. By the time the crowd gathered in front of the sheriff's office, the silver chain had become a set of silver spoons, which had become 3 silver cups, which had somehow become a collection of fine silver pieces that the Holden household had been missing for a month. Mara stood in the dirt street with her wrists tied in front of her with a short length of rough rope, and she watched the story build itself around her like a fence she couldn't see over. Sheriff Roy Deeks stood on his own porch looking like a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else. He was 52, heavy-set, with a gray mustache that he touched when he was uncomfortable, which was currently happening every 15 seconds. "Now, hold on," he said, not very firmly. "Let's slow down here." "Slow down." This was Aldous Pruitt, who had appeared from somewhere with the speed of a man who had been waiting nearby for exactly this kind of moment. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his rings glinting and his hands folded behind his back. "Roy, that girl has been stealing from the Holden family. From the Holden family. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand what Marcus is claiming." "Don't insult us." Pruitt's voice was smooth and cold, the kind of cold that isn't loud but fills a room. "We all know what she is. We've all seen her kind. Drifting in, taking what isn't theirs, making decent people's lives harder. Now you're going to stand there on your own porch and tell me you need more time." The crowd shifted. Mara could feel it, that particular movement that happens when people stop being individuals and start being a single organism with a single appetite. She looked for someone to meet her eyes. Anyone. Clement Greer was in the crowd. He'd given her work. He knew she could account for every hour she'd spent near his stable. He looked at the ground. There was a woman named Della Foss who had bought bread from Mara twice at the Thursday market and once told her she had good hands. Della Foss was looking at the middle distance. There was nobody. Mara had known she was alone for a long time. She'd been alone since her mother died of fever 3 years ago, and her father, a man of spectacular and reliable uselessness, had taken her to 3 different towns before losing her in the 4th one. Not in any dramatic way, just in the way that weak men lose things, by being somewhere else when it mattered. She'd been surviving on her own since she was 14, which had taught her practical things and one very clear truth. People are afraid of other people's trouble. They'll tell themselves stories. She must have done something. There must be a reason. Because the alternative is looking at someone suffering for no reason. And that's harder to live with than blame. She understood all of that. It still felt like a fist through the chest standing in that street. "Exile," someone in the crowd said. "Send her out." "Or worse," said someone else. Roy Deeks touched his mustache 3 times in quick succession. "Now we can't just... This is still a town with laws." "Then use them," Pruitt said. "Lock her up or run her out. Those are your choices, Roy." Mara looked at the rope on her wrists. She thought about what it would feel like to run, if she could run. Her ankles still ached from the jump off the hayloft. She'd need maybe 40 seconds to work her hands free. She'd been working at the knot since they tied her, but 40 seconds was too long in this crowd. She looked at the edge of town, at the long, flat road that led north into the canyon country, at the scrub and the red rock and the dusty nothing beyond the last building. That was when she heard the horse. Not the crowd noise of the town's horses, tied at posts, shifting and stamping. This was a single horse moving at a deliberate pace, coming from the south end of the main street, and it walked into the silence that happens when enough people feel something change in the air around them. The horse was a gray, not a pretty gray, not a show horse, but the color of something that had been tested by weather and come out harder for it. The man on it was not large in the way that makes people look twice its size. He was lean and long in the saddle, with the easy posture of someone who'd spent more of his life on a horse than off one. He wore a plain brown coat, trail-worn and not recently cleaned, and a hat that shaded his face until he was close enough that the shadow didn't matter anymore. He was maybe 40, maybe less, maybe more. The kind of face that makes age hard to guess because it isn't hiding from anything. There was a scar along his jaw that had long finished being new. His eyes were the color of creek water in October. He rode up to the edge of the crowd and stopped and did not say a word. The crowd moved. Not much, just that unconscious adjustment that bodies make when something they're not sure about gets close. A few people stepped aside without meaning to. Roy Deeks, who had been touching his mustache, stopped. "Coulter Shaw?" somebody in the crowd said, low. The name moved through the group like a breeze through dry grass. Mara didn't know the name, she would learn it, but what she noticed, standing there with rope on her wrists and nobody's eyes willing to hold hers, was that every single person in that crowd knew it. And whatever it meant to them, it wasn't nothing. Coulter Shaw looked at the crowd. Then he looked at Mara. His eyes moved to her wrists, then to her face. She held his gaze. She'd decided she wasn't going to look away from anything today, and she meant it, and something passed between them that she couldn't have named. Not pity, She would have felt pity and resented it. It was something more like recognition, the way two people who have both been in cold water can see it in each other without a word. "What's the charge?" His voice was flat and unhurried, not loud. It didn't need to be. "Theft," Marcus Holden had pushed to the front. "She stole from my family's house." Coulter looked at Marcus for a moment. "You witness it?" "We found property on her, That's not what I asked." Marcus went red. "Who are you to come in here and get—" "Didn't come in here?" Coulter's voice stayed level. "Was riding past. Heard noise." He looked at Roy Deeks. "She charged, Roy? Formally?" Roy Deeks touched his mustache. "Not yet as such. We're in the process of—" "So right now she's just a girl with her hands tied standing in the street." That landed in a specific way. A few people shifted. Aldous Pruitt stepped forward. His voice was practiced, smooth, certain, the kind of voice that had talked its way into and out of rooms for 30 years. "Mr. Shaw, I understand you've been away from this town for some time. Perhaps you're not aware of the situation. I'm looking at the situation. This girl is a known drifter, a thief. She's been terrorizing the decent residents of Black Hollow. Terrorizing." Coulter said the word like he was testing its weight and finding it too light. He looked at Mara again. She was still holding her chin up. He noticed. She could tell he noticed, and she hated that it mattered to her, but it did. "Roy," Coulter said, "you going to charge her or not?" Roy Deeks was a man being pulled in 6 directions by people stronger than him. He touched his mustache. He looked at Pruitt, then at Marcus Holden, then at Coulter Shaw. "The evidence is circumstantial," he said finally, which took what looked like genuine physical effort. "The chain, Marcus says it's his mother's, but we haven't verified." "Then you've got nothing." Coulter swung down off his horse in one easy motion. He walked to Mara. The crowd gave way, which she noticed, which told her something, and he looked at the rope on her wrists. He took a folding knife from his coat pocket, opened it, and cut the rope. Just like that. The crowd made a sound. Not words. More like a collective intake of breath. The sound of people who expected something to stop what was happening and are surprised when nothing does. Mara looked at her wrists. The rope marks were red and raw. She rubbed them once, automatically, then stopped because she didn't want to look like she needed to. Marcus Holden took 3 steps forward. "You have no right. You want to press a formal charge? Go ahead and press it." Coulter turned to face Marcus, and something in the turn, something in the absolute, unconcerned way he turned, made Marcus stop. "Roy'll hold her while you get your evidence together. But if you charge her with theft, you'll need to produce the stolen property, and you'll need a witness to the theft, and you'll need to stand in front of a judge and repeat what you told this crowd." He paused. "You want to do that, Marcus?" Marcus Holden stared at him. Coulter waited. The silence stretched out long enough to become a different kind of answer. "That's what I figured," Coulter said. He looked at Mara. "You got somewhere to be?" She opened her mouth and closed it. The honest answer was no. She'd never really had anywhere to be. "No," she said. "Then come on." He didn't wait for her to decide. He walked back to his horse and gathered the reins and looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has things to do and is willing to give her 10 seconds to be surprised before they get started. She looked at the crowd, all those people who hadn't looked at her, who had stood there while a story got built around her, and she looked at the road north, and she looked at this strange lean man with creek-colored eyes and a knife that had just cut her loose from something. She walked to him. Nobody stopped her. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was his presence, that quality he had of standing in the middle of whatever was happening, like he'd decided before he arrived that he wasn't going to be moved. Maybe it was that the crowd didn't quite know what to do when the story they were all performing in suddenly produced an unexpected line. He offered his hand to help her up behind him, and she ignored it. She'd been getting herself onto horses since she was 9, and swung up without assistance. She sat behind him with her hands braced on her own knees, not touching him, keeping her back straight. "You don't have to hold on?" he asked. "Not at a walk." Fair enough. They rode out of Black Hollow heading north, and Mara did not look back, not once, because looking back was something she'd sworn off the last time someone abandoned her and she'd made the mistake of watching them go. It took an hour and 40 minutes to reach the Shaw Ranch, which sat in the crease between two long slopes of scrub-covered rock at the edge of the canyon country. It wasn't pretty in any obvious way. No green lawns, no white fences, no architectural ambition whatsoever. There was a main house built from dark timber that had gone almost black with age, a barn that had been repaired so many times it looked like a conversation between different decades, a small corral, and a flat-roofed outbuilding that she would later learn was where he dried herbs and stored feed. There was no one else. She'd expected hands, cowboys, maybe a housekeeper, something. "You live alone?" she asked, sliding off the horse in the yard. "Yep." "Since when?" He gave her a look that wasn't hostile exactly, more like mild surprise that she'd asked. "While," he said. He took the horse to the barn. She stood in the yard and looked at the house and thought about the fact that she had gotten onto a stranger's horse in front of a hostile crowd and was now standing in a yard miles from anything, in the canyon country, with a man she knew nothing about except that he had a name that made a crowd step back. She was, she thought, either safe or in significantly worse trouble than she'd been this morning. She decided she'd find out. He came back from the barn and walked past her toward the house and held the door open without looking at her, which she took as an invitation. She went inside. The house was orderly, wasn't quite the right word, but it was the closest one. It was a space that had been made functional by someone who cared about function and didn't care much about anything else. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with two chairs, shelves of supplies, labeled in handwriting that was blocky and deliberate, a rifle on the wall, a coat hook by the door. No decoration, no softness. She stood in the middle of it and didn't know what to do with her hands. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yes." He opened a tin and set it on the table and got out bread and some dried meat without ceremony. She sat down and ate and tried not to eat too fast, which was hard because she was very hungry. He sat across from her with a cup of coffee and watched her eat in the way of someone who is thinking rather than watching. It wasn't rude, it was just attentive in a way she wasn't used to. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara Vane." "Where are you from, Mara Vane?" "Lot of places. Most recently nowhere." He accepted that. "How old are you?" 17. He looked at her for a moment. "The chain they found. You steal it?" She put down the bread. She'd been expecting this, the way everyone eventually got around to the real question. She met his eyes, which were the same color up close as they'd looked from a distance. "No," she said. He nodded once. "That's it?" she asked. "You just believe me?" "Didn't say that," he said. Said okay. "There's a difference." She thought about that. What does okay mean? Means we'll figure out what's true over time. Means right now it doesn't change anything either way. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "You didn't ask me why I helped you." "I was going to." "Why haven't you?" She picked up the bread again. "Because I'm eating first." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but a movement toward one. "Fair," he said. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the wind came through the canyon and the flat-roofed outbuilding creaked and the horse shifted in the barn. Mara listened to all of it, the sounds of a place that existed without requiring her, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not comfort, quite. More like a temporary absence of threat. After 3 years, she'd forgotten what that felt like. "So why did you?" she asked. He looked up. "Help me," she said. "You don't know me. You don't know if I'm a thief or not. You made a crowd of people angry. That's a lot to take on for a stranger." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, it was slow and considered, the way he seemed to do everything. "I've seen that crowd before," he said. "Different people, same crowd. I've been the person in the street." He looked at the window. Didn't like it much. Figured I'd do something different this time. It was not a dramatic answer. It didn't try to be, and maybe because it wasn't trying to be anything, she believed it. "The town's going to hate you for this," she said. "The town already hates me. This won't make much difference." "Why do they hate you?" The almost smile again. "That's a longer story." She slept that night in the outbuilding, on a cot he dragged from the barn, and covered with 2 wool blankets that smelled like cedar and dust. It wasn't comfortable. It was real, which was better. She lay awake for a long time listening to the canyon wind and thinking about the logic of her situation. She'd been in bad situations before and gotten herself through them by being honest about her odds. The honest math here was she was 17, alone, with no money, no supplies, no horse of her own, and she had just become publicly associated with a man that the most powerful people in Black Hollow evidently had feelings about. Her immediate circumstances had technically improved. She had food and shelter, but her long-term circumstances were arguably complicated. She stared at the dark ceiling and thought about Marcus Holden's face when he'd opened her coat pocket, the way he'd recognized the chain, or the way he'd recognized something. He'd known that chain. She was almost certain of it. She'd found it 4 days ago in the alley behind the land office, half buried in dust near the building's foundation. She'd picked it up because it had a broken clasp, and she thought she might be able to fix it and sell it, which was the kind of thinking you develop when you've been hungry long enough. She'd never seen it before. She didn't know whose it was, but Marcus Holden had, and he'd made a decision about it in less than 3 seconds. That was not the behavior of someone finding something unexpected. That was the behavior of someone recognizing something useful. She turned that over in the dark for a long time. In the morning, Coulter Shaw woke before light and was in the barn before Mara's eyes were open. She found him there when she came out, feeding the horse with the economical movements of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and doesn't think about it anymore. "What do you need from me?" she asked. She was still half asleep, her voice rough, her hair probably a mess. She hadn't had a mirror in 2 weeks and didn't expect to start caring about one now. "For staying here. What do you need?" He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She searched for the right way to say it. "Nobody gives something for nothing. I know what the bed and the food cost, and I'll pay it back however you need. Work, whatever. I'm not asking for charity." He was quiet for a moment, going back to the feed bucket. "I've got fence line that needs walking," he said finally. "North section's been hit by something, either weather or people. Haven't been out to look. I've got a water situation on the east slope that needs attention. The barn roof has a section that's been giving me trouble." He set down the bucket and looked at her. "You know how to use tools?" "Some." "You know how to ride?" "Yes." "Good enough for now." He started toward the house. "Breakfast first." She followed him. The sun was coming up behind the canyon walls, painting the red rock orange and gold in a way that would have been beautiful if she'd had the frame of mind for beautiful. She was thinking about the fence line, about being useful enough to stay somewhere long enough to figure out what Marcus Holden had seen when he looked at that silver chain. At the door, she stopped. "Coulter." He turned. "I'm not going to cause you trouble," she said, "or I'll try not to. But I think the trouble might come anyway. I think there's something bigger going on with the Holdens, and I think they're going to want to make sure I don't figure out what it is." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You already figured out there's something to figure out." "Yeah." "Then the trouble's already coming." He opened the door. "So we might as well have breakfast first." The first week had a texture to it that she would remember later as rough and real, and better than she deserved. She walked the fence line on the second day and found 3 sections pulled down, not by weather, by tools, the wire cut clean, and she reported it exactly as she'd seen it. He went out himself in the afternoon and looked and didn't say much. The third day she helped him repair the barn roof, which involved mostly holding things steady while he climbed and nailed, and she did it without complaint even when the angle made her arms ache. She learned that he drank his coffee with nothing in it, and that he ate his meals fast and without pleasure, the habit of a man who thinks of food as fuel more than anything. She learned that he was not mean, but he was not warm in any obvious way either. He was even, which was different from both, and after a few days she started to appreciate evenness more than she'd expected. She learned his name had weight in the territory for reasons people didn't quite want to talk about directly. She heard it in fragments, from the one time she rode into town for supplies, and the man at the general store went carefully neutral when she mentioned where she was staying. From the way the store's other customer, a weathered cattleman, made a small sound and looked at the window. On the 5th day, Coulter took her out to the flat behind the barn with 2 rifles. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "A little, not well." "Show me what you know." She picked up the rifle. She'd handled one before. Her father had owned one, which he'd used for almost nothing because he rarely had ammunition. But she'd learned the weight of it, the balance. She raised it and looked down the sight at the fence post he'd set up 40 yards out, and she breathed out slow, the way she'd read about in some penny publication once, and she squeezed the trigger instead of pulling it. The bullet hit the post 6 inches below where she aimed. Again, Coulter said. She reloaded, fired, 4 inches. Again, 2 inches. He came and stood beside her and adjusted her grip, hands repositioned slightly, elbow angle changed, a small correction to how she held her cheek against the stock, and she fired again. The post cracked. She lowered the rifle. He looked at the post, then at her. Do that again, he said. She did it again. Then from 60 yards, which should have been harder, and somehow wasn't. Something clicked into place in her, spatial, mathematical, the way a problem becomes clear when you stop fighting it and let the shape of it appear. She hit the post 4 out of 5 times at 60 yards, and the 5th time she knew the moment she'd squeezed too hard, before the gun even kicked. I should have pulled less, she said. Yeah, he said. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not exactly surprise, more like recalibration, like he was adjusting something in his thinking. You have any idea how many hands I've had out here who couldn't hit a fence post at 40 yards after a year of practice? I'm not practicing. I'm figuring it out. I know, that's what I mean. He took the rifle, checked it. You do it like you're solving something. She looked at the post. Isn't that what it is? He thought about it. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, I guess it is. Black Hollow's feelings about Coulter Shaw and Mara Vane came back to them on the 10th day in the form of Aldous Pruitt, who rode up the track to the ranch house at mid-morning on a spotted horse that was trying too hard to look fine. Mara was splitting wood near the barn. She stopped when she heard hooves and watched Pruitt come into the yard with the careful expression of a man delivering something he's already decided is certain. Coulter came out of the house. She didn't know how he'd heard. He'd been inside, and stood on the porch with his arms loose at his sides. Aldous, he said. Not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement of existence. Coulter. Pruitt stopped his horse in the yard and looked around with that appraising look of his, like he was already thinking about land values. His eyes passed over Mara and dismissed her in approximately half a second. I'll get to the point. People in town are upset. People in town are generally upset. About this. He gestured vaguely at the ranch. About your decision to take in that girl. It's causing talk. People in town talk about everything. Pruitt leaned forward in the saddle. Coulter. You're an intelligent man. This girl is a problem. She's a thief. She hasn't been charged with anything. That's a technicality. It's the whole thing, Aldous. Pruitt's smooth expression tightened just slightly. The Holden family is prepared to press formal charges if necessary. I'd rather it not come to that. I'd rather you send the girl on her way, and we all move forward. Simple. Coulter was quiet for a moment. He looked at Mara, actually looked at her, including her in whatever was happening rather than treating her like a prop in someone else's conversation, and then he looked back at Pruitt. She's staying, he said. Coulter, she's staying, Aldous. Go on back to town. The silence in the yard had quality to it. Mara watched Pruitt's face move through several rooms, frustration, calculation, something colder underneath both, before it settled back into its usual smoothness. This will go badly for you, Pruitt said. Not a threat, exactly. The way you say something when you're certain it's true. Might, Coulter agreed. Pruitt turned his horse and rode out. Mara watched him go, then looked at Coulter. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. He'll be back. I know. She picked up the axe again. I know he'll be back. She brought it down on the log, clean and sure. Coulter, she said, without looking up. I want to learn to shoot from a moving position, and I want to learn to track. You said you'd teach me frontier survival. I want to learn everything. He stood there for a moment. The canyon wind came through. The horse in the barn shifted. All right, he said. We'll start tomorrow. She split another log. The day around them was quiet and bright, the kind of beautiful that came with the canyon country when it wasn't trying to kill you. And even then, sometimes, with an honesty she was starting to appreciate. She didn't trust it. She'd learned not to trust the quiet spells. But she stayed in it for a moment, axe in her hands, wood chips on her boots, the red rock blazing orange in the mid-morning sun, and she let herself have the small, hard fact of it. She was still here. She was fed. She was learning. Tomorrow she would be better. That would have to be enough. The weeks that followed Pruitt's visit had a particular kind of tension in them. The tension of waiting for something you can't name but can feel coming the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. Coulter started her on tracking 3 days after he'd promised it. Not animal tracking, not yet. He took her out to the north fence line, the one with the cut wire she'd found on her second day, and he crouched in the dirt and showed her how to read it. See this? He pointed to a mark in the dust beside the post. Boot heel. Whoever stood here was heavier on their left side. Maybe an old injury, maybe just habit. He moved 6 feet east. Second person here, smaller boot, stood back while the first one worked, watching. Mar crouched beside him. The marks were faint. She wouldn't have called them marks at all on her own, would have called them disturbances in dirt. But looking where he pointed, she could see the shape of them. How do you know there were 2? She asked. The work pattern. The wire was cut in 3 places, 2 posts apart each time. One person cuts, they move straight down the line. 2 people, you get gaps, because the second one's looking around while the first one works. He stood. One person doesn't need a lookout. 2 people are nervous. She stood with him and looked at the fence line and tried to see what he saw. It was like learning to read a language that had no alphabet. Everything was already there, already present, and what she lacked was the grammar of it. She started carrying a small notebook. Not for sentimental reasons. She'd never been sentimental about writing things down. But because her memory was good and her reasoning was good, and she'd learned early that the combination of both got sharper when she forced herself to put things into words. She wrote down what the tracks looked like. She wrote down what Coulter told her. She wrote down what she noticed on her own. And then she asked him whether she was reading it right. And he was honest when she was wrong and brief when she was right, which she appreciated. He was not an easy teacher. He didn't explain things twice unless she asked, and he didn't praise her for getting things right the way she imagined a different kind of man might. What he did instead was give her harder problems when she solved the easy ones, which she came to understand was its own kind of acknowledgement. The shooting got sharper. It was almost alarming how fast, though, she'd stopped letting herself be alarmed by her own capabilities. That was a waste of energy. At 3 weeks, she could hit a moving target from 50 yards, which she'd accomplished the first time by accident and the second time by understanding what the accident had done right. Coulter had watched that second shot without speaking for a long moment. You were leading it, he said finally. I was calculating where it would be, she said, instead of where it was. Same thing. Not exactly. She lowered the rifle. Leading it is instinct. Calculating it is knowing why you're doing it. The second one doesn't fail when the instinct gets cold. He looked at her for a moment with that recalibrating expression. Where'd you learn to think like that? She shrugged. 3 years of figuring out how to eat. He didn't say anything to that. He handed her another cartridge. She loaded and fired and hit the mark clean. What she didn't tell him, not because she was hiding it, but because she was still working out what it meant, was that she'd been thinking about the Holdens every night before she slept, running through what she knew the way you run through the fence line, looking for the marks. Marcus had recognized that silver chain. Pruitt had shown up inside 4 days of her arriving, which meant news from Black Hollow traveled fast to wherever Pruitt got his instructions. The fence line had been cut by 2 people who were nervous. Livestock had been going missing from smaller ranchers in the valley. She'd heard it mentioned at the general store, the way people mention things they're worried about but not ready to say directly. She was building a picture. It wasn't finished yet, but it was acquiring shape. The shape of it was not good. 4 weeks in, Marcus Holden rode up to the ranch with a friend she didn't recognize and sat his horse at the edge of the yard without dismounting, which was either a threat display or a sign he wasn't planning to stay, and she couldn't yet tell which. Coulter came out of the barn. She stayed where she was, which was near the corral, near enough to hear. My father wants a word with you, Marcus said. Your father can come out here himself, Coulter said. I'll be here. Marcus's jaw tightened. He was the kind of young man whose face was honest about his emotions, which probably made him useful to people who needed to read him, and a liability to people who needed to hide things. You're making a mistake, Shaw. Keeping that girl. People in town are saying you've gone soft in the head. People in town say a lot of things. They're saying you're training a criminal, turning her into something dangerous. Coulter was quiet for a moment. She was already dangerous, he said. Just didn't know it yet. Marcus looked past him at Mara. She held his gaze. She'd gotten better at that. And she watched his eyes move over her in that calculating way, and then flick back to Coulter. And there was something in that flick, something quick and not quite comfortable, that she filed away. He was afraid of something, not her, not exactly, but something she represented. You'll regret this, Marcus said. Get off my land, Coulter said, and the flatness in his voice had an edge in it that Marcus apparently heard clearly enough, because he turned the horse without another word and rode out with his silent companion behind him. Mara walked over to where Coulter stood. He's scared, she said. Yeah, not of you. Of something else. She watched the dust settle where the horses had been. He looked at me like I was a problem he was still calculating. Because you are. Because I know something, or he thinks I do. She looked at Coulter. I found that chain in the alley behind the land office, Pruitt's building. The chain wasn't stolen from the Holden house. Marcus made that up on the spot, but he recognized it. Coulter was looking at the road, the way people look at something that's left but might come back. You think the chain came from Pruitt's office. I think it went through there. I think things go through that building that nobody's supposed to know about. The canyon wind came through. Somewhere on the east slope, one of the young horses they'd been working with made a sound. That's a theory, he said. That's a direction, she said. I'm going to find out if it goes somewhere. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was both careful and, she thought, not unsympathetic. Mara, if you're right, these aren't small people. Pruitt has half the town council in his pocket. The Holdens have the rest of the valley. This isn't a situation where being right protects you. I know that. So what are you going to do about it? Keep learning, she said, until I know enough. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went back into the barn. She took that as an answer. That night she sat on the flat rock behind the outbuilding where she slept, and she looked out at the canyon country in the dark, and she thought about what Coulter had said about being right, not protecting her. He wasn't wrong. She knew how Black Hollow worked. She'd lived in a dozen towns like it, where power was not separate from truth, but was, in fact, the thing that decided what truth was. If she went to Roy Deeks with a theory about Pruitt and the Holdens, Roy Deeks would listen with his hand on his mustache, and then he would go talk to Pruitt, and Pruitt would smooth it over in that cold, practiced way, and then Mara would be in a significantly worse position than she was now. What she needed was not a theory. What she needed was evidence. The shape of the thing was becoming clearer. The fence line cut by two nervous men, the missing livestock, a silver chain near Pruitt's building, Marcus's instant recognition, Pruitt's speed in showing up at the ranch. It was a picture of people moving things, property, animals, maybe more, through Black Hollow's canyon country and blaming the losses on a convenient drifter, blaming them on her. That was the part that turned something cold and quiet in her chest. Not the injustice of it, which she'd had practice absorbing, but the precision of it. She hadn't been a random target. She'd been useful. Someone had seen a drifter girl in Clement Greer's stable and understood that she was the kind of person nobody would defend, the kind who could be made into a story. She'd been selected. The cold, quiet thing in her chest became something harder and more purposeful. She was not, by nature, a vengeful person. She'd learned early that anger as a fuel burns hot and short, and she needed something slower. But she was, by nature, a person who needed to understand why things happened, and she was not going to be able to rest inside this particular story until she'd turned it over and shown what was underneath. The next morning she told Coulter she wanted to ride the canyon trails. He looked up from the bridle he was mending. Why? I want to know the country. He looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who missed much, and she knew he wasn't fooled by the vague answer. But he also seemed to understand that some things needed space to become clear before they could be said directly. Northwest Trail follows the canyon wall for about 6 miles, he said. Branches at a rock formation that looks like a broken tooth. You'll know it when you see it. Take the lower branch. The upper goes too close to the Holden grazing land, and I don't want you near Marcus today. Fair, she said. She took the gray. He'd been letting her ride it for 2 weeks. Not officially given over, but understood between them, and she rode northwest into the canyon country with the notebook in her coat pocket, and her eyes open for everything. The canyon was different from inside it than it looked from the ranch yard. Up close, it had texture. Variations in the rock color, shelves and overhangs, narrow passages where the walls came close enough to touch both sides with outstretched arms. She could see why people used it. The territory moved differently in here. A person who knew these passages could take animals through in the dark, unseen from the valley. They could move things from one place to another without appearing on the open plain where someone might notice. She found the Broken Tooth Formation. Coulter was right, there was no other way to describe it, and took the lower branch. The trail narrowed and switchbacked down into a denser part of the canyon where the walls were high enough that the sun only came in for a few hours in the middle of the day. She was picking her way carefully when the gray lifted its head and went very still. She stopped immediately. She'd been learning to read the horse the way Coulter read the ground, looking at what the animal's body was telling her before she decided what to do with the information. The horse's ears were forward and turned slightly right. She sat still and listened. Voices. Low, coming from around a rock shelf to her right. 2, maybe 3 people. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out tone, which was tense and intermittent, the way people talk when they're doing something while talking, when part of their attention is on the conversation and part of it is on the work. She dismounted, tied the gray to a scrub pine with a quick release knot the way Coulter had shown her, and she moved forward along the canyon wall on foot. Her boots were quiet on the rock. She'd gotten better at that, and the wind was moving toward her rather than away, which kept her scent from going ahead. She came around the shelf and looked. 3 men in the narrow passage below, 2 horses, and between them, lashed to a rough wooden frame, something covered with canvas. She couldn't see what was under the canvas, but it was heavy. The horses were straining, and the men were working hard to keep the load moving through the passage. She looked at the men. She didn't know 2 of them. The third one was a man she'd seen at the general store in Black Hollow. He worked for Pruitt's land office. She'd noticed him because he had a habit of standing too still in public spaces, the kind of stillness that's not relaxed but watchful. She watched them work the load through the passage and disappear around the next curve. She stayed still for a full 2 minutes after the sound of them faded, not trusting the silence. Then she went back to the gray and rode back the way she'd come, not hurrying, because hurrying makes noise. When she got back to the ranch, she found Coulter at the water trough, and she told him what she'd seen without dramatizing it. He listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the canyon hills. 3 men, she said. One of them I recognized from Pruitt's office, a heavy load they were working hard to move, through that lower canyon passage. That passage comes out in the Kellerman Valley, he said, on the other side. Who's in the Kellerman Valley? Nobody legitimate. He was quiet for a moment. There's been a buyer, someone collecting cattle that can't be traced to a registered brand, running them east into territories where the record-keeping is loose. His jaw was tight. I didn't have proof. Just rumors from people who'd lost stock and couldn't explain how. Mara looked at him. They've been running stolen cattle through that canyon. Looks like. And they needed somebody to blame the losses on. She paused. They found me. He looked at her then, and she saw in his face something that wasn't quite anger. Anger would have been easier, something more like a man absorbing a fact he'd halfway known was coming. Yeah, he said. Looks like. She thought about the men in the canyon, about the load under the canvas, about Pruitt's gold rings and Marcus Holden's calculating eyes and the crowd in Black Hollow that had been so ready to believe the story they were given. I need to go back, she said, more than once. I need to map that route. Mara, I know it's dangerous, but I can move in that canyon quieter than you can, and I can track better than I could a month ago, and they haven't seen my face close enough to know me. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do so you know where I am. He looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon sun was cutting sideways across the yard, and it caught the gray's coat and made it look almost silver. You'll take the rifle, he said. I was going to take the rifle. You'll leave me a route map before you go each time, in case. In case what? He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded. In case, she agreed. She went into the outbuilding and she opened her notebook and she drew what she could remember of the canyon passage from her afternoon ride. The turns, the rock formations, the place where the walls came close. She drew the wooden frame and wrote down what she could remember about the men. She wrote down what Coulter had said about the Kellerman Valley. She sat with the notebook for a while, looking at what she'd built. It wasn't enough yet. It was the beginning of enough. Outside, the canyon country was turning dark at its edges first, the way it did, the red rock going purple, and then gray while the center of the sky stayed lit a little longer. She could hear Coulter moving in the barn. She could hear the wind in the outbuilding's flat roof. She thought about the crowd in Black Hollow, about their faces when the story was being built, about how fast and easy it had been, how little it took to take a person who had nothing and make them into a reason. She thought about Coulter riding up that street and cutting her loose without asking for proof, without asking for permission. She still wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Gratitude sat in her chest in an unfamiliar way, heavy and a little uncomfortable, the way anything sits when you're not used to its weight. She closed the notebook. She wasn't done being angry, but she was starting to understand what to do with it, not burn it off, not waste it on the obvious targets. Sharpen it, aim it. Tomorrow she'd go back into the canyon. Tonight she slept better than she expected. She went back into the canyon 6 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time she left a route map on the table in the outbuilding before dawn, the way Coulter had asked. Each time she rode out before the light was full and came back before it failed, and each time she brought something back in the notebook that she hadn't had before. The men's schedule. They moved through the lower passage every 4 to 5 days, always in the same direction, always with the canvas-covered loads that were heavy enough to slow the horses. A second man from Pruitt's office, different from the first, who appeared on the 3rd trip and whose face she memorized with the particular attention she'd been developing for things that mattered. A third figure she couldn't place, older, heavy-set, who stood apart from the working men and watched the loads being moved with the proprietary stillness of someone counting what belonged to him. She didn't know his name yet. She wrote down everything she could see, the cut of his coat, the silver buckle on his belt, the way he stood with his weight on his right leg. She drew his face as well as she could, which wasn't well, but was enough to capture the broad jaw and the way his hat sat forward. On the 5th trip, she got close enough, downwind and behind a shelf of red rock, to hear fragments of conversation. Kellerman's man says he wants the next shipment doubled. Can't double it without more time. We're already pushing. Pruitt says the girl's still out at Shaw's place. She went very still at that. Thought Shaw would have run her off by now. Shaw doesn't run people off. That's his whole problem. This was the heavy-set man. His voice was lower than the others, the kind of low that expects to be listened to. We need this cleaned up. Deeks is getting nervous. Deeks is always nervous. Nervous sheriffs make mistakes. A pause. She heard something scrape. A boot on rock, maybe. Handle it. Both of them if you have to. She pressed herself flat against the rock and did not breathe until the voices moved away and she heard the horses start up again. Then she lay there with her cheek against the cold stone and felt the specific cold of having just heard someone discuss whether she should be alive. She rode back to the ranch with her hands steady on the reins because she made them steady. She'd learned that panic was a thing you could refuse, not easily, but by decision. And when she got to the yard, she put the gray in the corral and went and sat at the table in the outbuilding for a while before she did anything else. Both of them, if you have to. She opened the notebook. She wrote down what she'd heard, word for word as best she could, and then she sat with the pen in her hand and looked at what she'd written. It was the first time any of this had included Coulter directly. Everything else, the charges, the crowd, the brand of thief they'd burned on her, that was aimed at her. She was the useful object, but she'd gone and gotten herself taken in by a man with a reputation and a rifle, and they were recalculating. She was no longer just a problem they'd created. She was a problem living on someone else's land, protected by someone else's name, and now that someone else was being pulled into it because of her. She sat with that for longer than was comfortable. When she came out, Coulter was at the fence post near the barn, replacing a board that had split. He didn't look up when she walked over, but he stopped working, which was the same thing. She told him what she'd heard. He listened without moving. When she finished, he set down the hammer and looked at the post for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was thinking, not avoidance, just somewhere to put his eyes while his mind worked. "The heavy-set man," he said, broad jaw, silver buckle, weight on the right side. "You know him?" "Sounds like Vern Calloway." He looked at her. He's out of Ridgeline usually, moves between 3 or 4 territories. He's not local to Black Hollow. He'd be hired in. Hired for what? Moving things. Running the operation on the ground so the people behind it keep their hands clean. He picked up the hammer again and didn't swing it. If Calloway's involved, this is bigger than Pruitt and the Holdens operating a little side business. Calloway doesn't work small. The word Ridley came back to her then, the fragment she'd heard in Clement's stable the morning this started. If my father finds out about the Ridley shipment, she told Coulter. His jaw tightened, not the expression she'd seen before, the controlled flat expression he wore when things were merely complicated. This was something else. Ridley's not a person, he said. It's a rail junction, 70 miles east. If you're moving stolen livestock through canyon country and out the other side of the Kellerman Valley and you're heading to a rail junction, he stopped. You can ship them anywhere, Mara said. You can disappear them. Brand doesn't travel with the animal once it's loaded onto a rail car in a different territory. They come out the other end as someone else's property. He set the hammer down on the fence rail. That's not a local operation, that's organized. That's money behind it. Pruitt's the money. Maybe. Or Pruitt's one piece of it. He looked at the canyon hills. Calloway said handle it. That's not a vague instruction. No, she agreed. It's not. She watched his face work through something. She'd gotten better at reading him over 6 weeks, learned the specific difference between his thinking silences and his not ready to speak silences. This was the latter. Say what you're thinking, she said. He looked at her. I'm thinking you should leave. She'd expected it. She'd been preparing for it the whole ride back, which was maybe why it still landed wrong anyway. Leave. Right east. Get out of the territory. You've got enough in that notebook to send to a territorial marshal. I can write the letter. I know who to contact. That takes weeks, she said, maybe months, and in the meantime they move the operation. They burn what they need to burn, and Calloway... She stopped. And they never pay for what they did to me. Mara, I know what you're trying to do, she said, and she kept her voice even because she wasn't angry at him. Not exactly, even though something in her wanted to be. You're trying to keep me safe, and I understand that, but I'm not going to run. I ran my whole life. I'm done with it. Running isn't always... I know what running is. Her voice came out sharper than she meant. She took a breath. I know the difference between surviving and giving up. I've done both. This isn't either. This is... She stopped because she was struggling for the right word. Justice? He said, not mockingly. Evidence, she said. Just evidence. I want to put the real thing in front of people so they can't look away from it. That's all. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came through and moved the dry grass along the fence line, and the broken board shifted. What are you planning? He asked. She'd been working on this since the third canyon trip, building it out the same way she built a shot, calculating where the target would be, not where it was. The next shipment. They said they want it doubled, and the schedule's been every 4 to 5 days. That means the next move is in 2 days, maybe 3. I know the passage. I know where they stage the loads. She looked at him. I need to get to where that load goes before they move it. To Calloway's staging point. To wherever they're holding what they've taken. If I can get there with the notebook and physical evidence, brands on the animals, records if there are any, that's something a territorial marshal can't dismiss. That's something Roy Deeks can't bury. Getting there means going deeper into the canyon than you have before, past where you've been. Yes? At night, most likely, since they'll be watching the passage in daylight before a move. Yes. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first day in the street, that recognizing look, the one that wasn't pity. Then he looked at the canyon country above them, the red rock going rust-colored in the late light. I know a second route, he said. Longer. Comes in from the south side of the canyon. Avoids the main passage entirely. He paused. I haven't used it in years. I'd need to ride it first, make sure it's passable. She understood what he was offering. You'd come with me. I'd come with you. She almost said you don't have to, and stopped herself because it was both obvious and beside the point. Instead, she said, when can you ride the south route? Tomorrow. Then we go the day after. He picked up the hammer again. Go get dinner started. We're not going to solve it standing in the yard. It was not a warm statement, It was the kind of statement that means this conversation is decided and now we do the next thing, which from him she'd come to understand as a form of respect. She went and started dinner. That night she sat with the notebook and organized everything she had. She numbered the entries, cross-referenced the dates, drew a clean version of the canyon map with the passage marked, and the staging point estimated. She did it carefully and completely, because careful and complete meant something you could hand to someone else, and have it mean what you needed it to mean. She also wrote out a summary, plain language, factual, no drama, of what she'd observed, what she'd heard, what she'd concluded, and why. When she was done, she looked at it for a while. It was 6 weeks of work. It was everything she had. She folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where it sat against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The next day, Coulter rode the south route alone and came back in the late afternoon with mud on the gray's legs and a look on his face that said the route existed and was passable and was also not pleasant. "To 2 narrow sections," he said at dinner. "We go single file and we go slow. No talking in the canyon once we're in." "Understood." "There's a shelf about 3 miles in where we can look down into the staging area, if I'm right about where it is. We'll need to see before we go closer." He ate in the methodical way he always ate. "If there are more than 3 men, we don't go down. And if there are 3 or fewer," he looked at her over the table, "then we figure it out." She would have pushed for a more specific plan, but she'd learned that Coulter's version of figure it out wasn't vagueness. It was an acknowledgement that some things couldn't be planned past a certain point, and that over-planning what couldn't be controlled was a way of making yourself stupid. She'd started to trust that about him. They left before first light, 2 days after Pruitt's man had talked about doubling the shipment. The canyon in the dark was a different country than the canyon in the day. The walls absorbed the sound differently, made the space feel tighter. The horses moved carefully, which was good. This was not the time for an animal that needed managing. The gray was steady under her, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't take time to examine. They moved through the first narrow section in single file, as he'd said. The rock walls came within arm's length on both sides, and she could feel the closeness of it without being bothered by it, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel trapped. Instead, she felt focused. The second narrow section opened onto a series of shelves, stacked like rough steps down the canyon's inner face. Coulter stopped at the highest shelf, and she came up beside him. From here she could see down into a wider section of the canyon below, a natural chamber, almost, where the walls pulled back and the floor flattened. She could see firelight. Not much. Controlled, small, the kind of fire you build when you don't want to be seen from above, but enough to see by. And in the light of it, animals. Cattle, penned loosely between the canyon walls and a crude rope barrier. She counted 14, 15, possibly more in the shadow at the back. And men. She counted 4 at the fire. A 5th one moving at the edge of the light, checking the rope barrier. 5. Coulter held up 5 fingers. She nodded. He shook his head slowly. They'd said 3 or fewer. 5 was too many. She almost accepted it. She was reaching that acceptance, the rational, trained part of her agreeing with his logic, when one of the men at the fire stood and moved into the light, and she saw his face. The broad jaw. The silver buckle. The forward-sitting hat. Calloway. And beside him, newly arrived or newly noticed, Marcus Holden, standing at the fire with his coat on and his expression doing that thing it did when he was nervous, touching his own face, eyes moving. She felt Coulter go still beside her. She looked at him. He was looking at Marcus Holden with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not surprise, something older and more complicated. Like a man watching a thing confirm what he'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. She put her mouth close to his ear. "We need the records. If they have any papers, ledgers." He turned to look at her. He was close enough that she could see him clearly, even in the dark canyon. "The tent," she breathed. There was a canvas structure at the far edge of the firelight, makeshift but deliberate. The kind of thing you set up if you need a place to keep things dry. He looked at the tent, looked at the 5 men, looked at the cattle. He looked at her. She could see him calculating it, all of it. The odds and the distances and the things that could go wrong. She'd watched him calculate enough times to recognize it, and she could see the moment the calculation came out the way it came out, the moment he made a decision that was not the cautious one. He unholstered his rifle. She already had hers. They moved down the shelf in the dark and did not make a sound, because they'd practiced that, because 6 weeks of being taught by a careful man had taught her what careful actually meant. Not slow, deliberate, not timid, precise. She set her feet the way he'd shown her, and she moved through the dark, like something that belonged in it. They reached the canyon floor 30 yards from the firelight, behind a rock formation that gave them cover and a clear sight line. The tent was 15 yards to their left. The 5 men were 20 yards ahead. She looked at Coulter. He held up 2 fingers and pointed to himself, then toward the fire. Then 1 finger pointed at her, then at the tent. She understood. He'd hold their attention. She'd get to the tent. Her heart was moving fast, but she noticed it the way she noticed wind direction, as information, not interference. She tightened her grip on the rifle, breathed out, and waited for him to move. He stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight and said, in his flat, unhurried voice, "Evening." 5 heads turned. She ran. She covered the 15 yards to the tent in the time it took the 5 men at the fire to process what they were looking at. Coulter's voice carried clearly in the canyon chamber, that flat, unhurried tone that somehow filled space without needing to be loud. "Nobody needs to do anything stupid tonight. I'd appreciate it if you kept that in mind." She heard Calloway's voice cut back. "Shaw, you've got a lot of nerve riding into my camp. Your camp's on open canyon land. Didn't see your name on the rock." She was at the tent flap. She pushed inside without hesitating. It was dark. The fire's light barely reached the canvas walls. And she gave herself 3 seconds to let her eyes adjust before she moved. There was a folding table. On it, a lantern that was unlit, 2 tin cups, and what she was looking for. A leather-bound ledger, closed, with a loose sheaf of papers beneath it held down by a rock. She grabbed the ledger and the papers and shoved them inside her coat against the notebook that was already there. The papers crinkled and she pressed them flat with her arm and told herself to breathe. Outside, Calloway's voice had gone colder. "Where's the girl?" Silence from Coulter, which meant he hadn't answered, which meant they were looking around. She was out of the tent in the same motion she'd gone in, moving along the canyon wall away from the firelight, back toward the rock formation where they'd started. She heard boots on stone, someone moving fast, and she pressed herself into a shadow behind a boulder and went completely still. One of Calloway's men came around the edge of the firelight with a rifle up, scanning. He was 12 feet from her. She could see the whites of his eyes catching the fire's glow. She did not move. She did not breathe in a way that made sound. The man turned a slow half-circle, looking at the canyon walls, at the dark spaces between rocks, and then looked back toward the fire. "Nothing over here," he called. "Check the tent," Calloway said. She moved the moment the man turned back toward camp. She went fast and low along the wall, feet finding the path she'd memorized coming down, and she got back to the formation and crouched behind it and looked at the firelit scene ahead. It had changed. In the 60 seconds she'd been at the tent, the balance at the fire had shifted in the way that happens when men stop being uncertain and start being decided. 2 of Calloway's men had fanned out to either side of Coulter. Coulter stood with his rifle in his hands, not raised, not lowered, held with the specific neutrality of a man who wants it known he can raise it faster than the other side is counting on. Marcus Holden had moved back from the fire, which was either cowardice or tactical. She couldn't tell from here. Then the man she'd sent to check the tent called out, "Ledger's gone, papers too." The temperature of the camp changed instantly. She felt it from 30 yards away. Calloway looked at Coulter. "She's here." "Don't know what you're talking about," Coulter said. "She was just in my tent." "A lot of things in a canyon at night." Calloway's voice dropped the smooth pretense it had been carrying. What came out underneath was something flat and specific. The voice of a man who has made decisions like this before and does not lose sleep over them. "Take him." 2 men moved at once. Coulter swung the rifle up, but the third man, the one who'd come back from checking the canyon wall, came from the side and hit him across the shoulder with something, a rifle stock or a club, and Coulter went down to one knee. The rifle went sideways. One of the others got hold of it and wrenched it away. Mara was already moving. She came out from behind the formation at a run, cutting right to get a clear angle, and she raised the rifle and fired once into the rock wall above the fire. Not at anyone, not yet, but close enough that the sound cracked off the canyon walls like a flat hand on stone, and the muzzle flash lit the whole chamber for half a second. Everyone stopped. She came to a stop with the rifle up, sighted on Calloway's chest, and she breathed out slow and held it. The canyon went so quiet she could hear the cattle moving at the rope barrier. Calloway looked at her. She was prepared for dismissal. She was 17, and she was a girl, and she understood that most men in that situation would make a rapid and potentially fatal calculation about what those two things meant for her ability to follow through. She was prepared for it. She'd thought about it on the ride in. She'd decided that if it happened, she would demonstrate the error as quickly and unambiguously as possible. Calloway did not dismiss her. He was a man who had been in enough situations to read them, and what he read in her, she didn't know exactly what he saw, but she knew what was there. 6 weeks of practice, 2 months of hunger that had preceded it, and 3 years of surviving things that were supposed to stop her. Whatever he read, it stopped him. "Let him up," she said. Nobody moved. "I've got a ledger and your shipping records inside my coat," she said. Her voice was level. She was somewhat amazed that it was level, but she didn't examine that. Later, maybe. "I've also got 6 weeks of observation notes, dates, descriptions, routes. I know about Ridley. I know about the Kellerman buyer. I know Pruitt's involved, and I know what the Holden land's been used for." She paused. "And I can put a bullet through your shoulder from this distance without trying particularly hard. So let him up." Asamekam. Calloway looked at her for a moment that lasted about 3 years. Then he said, "Let Shaw up." The man holding Coulter's arm released him. Coulter got to his feet, retrieving his balance in that careful way of someone taking inventory of what got hit and deciding it's not bad enough to matter yet. He looked at Mara. She didn't look back. She couldn't take her eyes off Calloway, but she felt him looking. "All right," Calloway said. He had the tone of a man changing his approach, not surrendering it. "You want to talk business? Fine. Talk." "This isn't a negotiation," she said. "I'm telling you how this ends. You and your men stand down. We leave. What I have in my coat goes to the Territorial Marshal's office in Ridgeline. You can run or you can wait. That's up to you. But you're done in this canyon." "And the Holdens? Pruitt?" "Same thing. Done." Marcus Holden made a sound from his position near the edge of the firelight. She flicked her eyes to him for half a second. He was pale, his hand at his mouth, the nerve he'd brought into the canyon having apparently spent itself. He looked younger than 26. He looked like what he was, a man who'd inherited a position without inheriting the stomach for what maintaining it required. "Calloway," Marcus said, his voice coming out thin, "this isn't... We need to think." "Shut up, Marcus," Calloway said without looking at him. Marcus shut up. One of Calloway's men, the one on the left, who she'd been tracking in her peripheral vision, shifted his weight. It was a small movement. It was the kind of small movement that precedes a larger one, and she'd learned to read it the same way she'd learned to read everything else over the past 6 weeks, as information that required immediate action. She swung the rifle left and fired. The bullet hit the dirt 6 inches from the man's boot. He went very still. "Don't," she said. He went stiller. She brought the rifle back to Calloway. Her ears were ringing from the shot in the enclosed canyon space, and she ignored it. Her hands were steady. She was angry about a lot of things, and it turned out that anger, sharpened down to this point, was not a bad thing to be running on. "The ledger has Pruitt's signature on at least 4 entries, she said. "I saw it in the tent. I didn't have time to read everything, but I saw his name." She was watching Calloway's face for confirmation, and she got it, a small tightening around his eyes. "That's not me guessing. That's in there. Whatever you think you can manage after tonight, you can't manage that." Calloway was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. One of the cattle at the rope barrier made a low, unhappy sound. "You're smarter than you look," Calloway said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement, which was different. "Most people are," she said. She and Coulter backed out of the canyon the way they'd come in. Slow, controlled, rifles up until the firelight was far enough behind them that the dark swallowed it. She kept listening for the sound of pursuit and heard nothing, which she didn't entirely trust. When they reached the horses, she let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like an hour, but was probably 4 minutes. Coulter mounted without speaking, and she swung up behind him because they'd ridden out together, and she wasn't putting him through waiting for her to be ceremonial about self-sufficiency right now. She held the saddlebag with one hand and kept the rifle across her knees. They rode the south route back in the dark, and neither of them spoke until they were out of the canyon and onto the open slope, and the ranch lights were visible below. "You shot near his foot," Coulter said. "He was about to do something." "I know. I saw it." He paused. 6 inches is close. "I had 4 inches of margin, and I used 2 of them." He needed to believe it was an accident. Another pause. The gray moved steadily down the slope, and the night was cold and very clear. "Was it?" he asked. "No," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, not humor exactly, more like relief finding an odd exit. She felt the tension in his back release by some fraction, which she hadn't fully realized she'd been aware of until it changed. They got back to the ranch and put the horse up and went inside, and she spread the ledger and papers on the table under the lamp while Coulter put water on and stood across from her with his arms crossed and his shoulder at an angle that suggested it was bothering him more than he was saying. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're holding it wrong." She looked up from the ledger. "Sit down. Let me look at it." "Mara, sit down, Coulter." He sat. She examined his shoulder with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine from necessity and not inclination, probing gently, watching his face for the specific kind of tension that meant bone versus the kind that meant muscle. It was muscle and bruising, deep and ugly, but nothing broken. "You'll need to keep it moving," she said. "If you let it stiffen, it'll be worse tomorrow." "I know." "Then why are you holding it like that?" "Because it hurts," he said, as though this were a reasonable and complete explanation, which she supposed it was. She got the salve from the shelf, she'd found it on her second week, labeled in his blocky handwriting for what hurts, and she handed it to him because she was not going to help him apply it. They had not arrived at that kind of relationship, and he took it without comment. She turned back to the ledger. The lamp was good light, and the ledger's handwriting was cramped but legible. It was, in structure, a shipping record. Dates, quantities, descriptions written in shorthand that she had to puzzle through, but which was not designed for real security, just for the casual glance. HDG XD was headed and crossed, branded cattle with the original brand altered. KLFWD was Kellerman Ford, dollar amounts in the right column, and signatures. Not every entry, but enough. Pruitt, 3 times in the first 20 pages. And once, in a different hand, a name she hadn't expected, S. Holden, not Marcus. Silas. She sat with that for a moment. The father, not the son, which reframed everything she'd thought she understood about Marcus. His nervousness, his visible fear at the fire tonight. Marcus wasn't the architect of this. Marcus was a man who'd found out what his father was doing and gotten himself stuck on the wrong side of it, either through loyalty or through knowing that the alternative was worse. She almost felt something for him. Not much, but a small, complicated something. She looked at the papers under the ledger, the loose sheaf she'd grabbed. They were correspondence, some of it. She read quickly, pulling out the pieces that mattered. A letter from Pruitt to Calloway establishing the routing, a reply that outlined the Ridley Junction arrangement, and underneath that a single sheet that was neither correspondence nor ledger. It was a list of names, handwritten in a third style she didn't recognize. 7 names. Ranchers, she thought. The names had the look of people, not businesses. She didn't know 5 of them. The 6th was a man named Walt Deering, whom she'd heard mentioned at the general store as someone who'd lost a substantial number of cattle last spring. The 7th name on the list was Coulter Shaw. She looked at it for a long time. "Coulter," she said. He was across the room, still working on the shoulder with an expression of moderate suffering. He looked up. She turned the paper so he could see it from where he sat. He got up and came to the table and looked at the list. She watched his face. He went through several expressions in quick succession. Recognition, something darker, a cold settling. "That's a target list," she said. "Yeah. They were going to take your cattle next. Or the land." He straightened up. "The ranch sits over the South Canyon access. If I'm gone, whoever owns this land controls the route." She thought about Pruitt's visit, the smoothness of it, the confidence. This will go badly for you. Not a threat. A timeline. He'd already known what came next. "They needed you out first," she said, "or compromised. And when you took me in, you became a different kind of problem. Taking me in meant you might eventually find out what I was getting close to. So they sent Calloway. Handle it. Both of them if you have to. The words she'd heard on the canyon shelf came back with the specific weight of things that have been confirmed. They were going to move on the ranch. Coulter stood at the table and looked at the ledger and the papers and the list with his name on it, and she could see him processing the full shape of it. Not just tonight, not just the canyon, but the whole architecture of what had been built around them both. He looked tired. Not weak. She'd never seen him look weak, but tired in the way of a man who is adding up a bill he didn't run up and finding it larger than he'd expected. How much of this is enough? He asked. Not despairing. Practical. He wanted to know if what they had would hold. She thought about it honestly. The ledger with Pruitt's signature is enough to open an investigation. The correspondence establishes the route and the arrangement. The list is circumstantial on its own, but combined with everything else... She paused. It's enough for a territorial marshal who wants to find the truth. It's not enough for one who doesn't. So it depends on who we get. It depends on who we get, she agreed. He looked at her. I know a man. Out of the territorial marshal's office in Casper. He's not in Pruitt's pocket. I'd stake something on that. You know him personally? Knew him, years ago. He moved back to his chair slowly, favoring the shoulder. We weren't friends exactly, but we understood each other. She filed away years ago, and not friends exactly, under the category of things she'd learned about Coulter Shaw that she hadn't been told directly. That category had been filling steadily since the beginning, and she'd stopped being surprised by additions to it. He was a man with a past the way the canyon was a place with depth. You kept going and kept finding more. Can you reach him without going through Black Hollow? She asked. Telegraph at Fenton's Crossing, 20 miles north. Roy Deeks doesn't have eyes up there. Then we go tomorrow. Tomorrow, he said. Outside, the canyon was dark and quiet, and the night was doing what nights do, holding whatever had happened in it without comment, without judgment, just the fact of it. The fire was out now, probably. Calloway's men were doing whatever Calloway's men did when a plan went sideways. Marcus Holden was somewhere between the canyon and his father's ranch, carrying the specific weight of a man who has run out of ways to avoid what he already knows. She took the ledger and the papers and put them back inside her coat. She wasn't leaving them on the table. She wasn't leaving them anywhere she wasn't. Get some sleep, Coulter said. You too. She went to the door of the house and stopped. She wanted to say something. She could feel the shape of it without finding the words for it. The night in the canyon. The way he'd stepped into the firelight so she could get to the tent. The fact that his name was on that list and he'd come anyway. She didn't say any of it. Coulter, she said. He looked up. Good call, she said. Tonight, stepping out like that. He was quiet for a moment. You got the ledger. Because you stepped out. He looked at the table. Get some sleep, Mara. She went out into the cold night air and walked to the outbuilding and sat on the cot with her coat still on and the papers against her ribs. And she looked at the dark ceiling and felt the specific aliveness of a person who came very close to a thing and came out the other side of it with something to show for the risk. It wasn't triumph. It was too raw for triumph. It was more like the moment after a difficult shot when the calculation proves out. A cold clarity, the satisfaction of a thing understood correctly. She lay back on the cot without taking the coat off. Tomorrow, Fenton's Crossing, 20 miles north. A telegraph to a man Coulter had known years ago in circumstances he hadn't explained. It was not a solid plan, but it was the next right step. And in her experience, that was usually the only kind of plan that actually worked. They rode to Fenton's Crossing in the gray early morning before Black Hollow was awake enough to notice the direction of anyone's horse. The 20 miles north felt longer than 20 miles. Not because the terrain was bad, though it wasn't easy, but because they were both running on a few hours of thin sleep and the particular kind of alertness that follows a night where things could have gone differently. Mara rode the gray and Coulter rode a roan mare he kept for long distances, and they made the crossing by mid-morning with the sun still climbing and the canyon country behind them looking almost peaceful from this distance, which she found vaguely insulting. Fenton's Crossing was not a town. It was a trading post, a telegraph station, a water trough, and 4 buildings that had been constructed with the ambition of becoming something and had stopped partway through. The telegraph operator was a small man named Birch, who looked at them the way people at remote stations look at everyone who arrives, with mild interest and no particular investment. Coulter wrote the telegram himself, standing at the counter, taking more time over it than she expected. She read it when he slid it across. Marshall Wren Holt. Casper. Evidence of organized cattle theft and land fraud in Black Hollow territory. Ledger with signatures. Correspondence. Physical evidence secured. Need your office, not local law. Time matters. C. Shaw. Birch took it without comment and tapped it out, and they waited. The reply came in 40 minutes, which told Mara something about Wren Holt, that he was either at his desk or close to it, and that the name C. Shaw had made him come to the wire quickly. Birch wrote it out and handed it over. Coulter read it and passed it to her. Shaw. Didn't expect to hear from you. Riding with 2 deputies. 4 days. Don't let the evidence out of your hands. Holt. 4 days. She folded the paper and put it in her coat with everything else. 4 days was a long time if Calloway moved fast. It was also, she reminded herself, long enough if they were smart about it. He knows you, she said as they rode back south. We crossed paths years back, before I came out here. Coulter's eyes were on the trail. He's a straight man, not perfect, but straight. He doesn't owe Pruitt anything. She thought about asking what crossed paths meant, in the way that years ago and not friends exactly had been left open. She decided against it. She was learning that Coulter Shaw had a past that was his, and that him choosing to share pieces of it on his own schedule was part of a boundary she could respect. He'd earned that, the same way she'd earned the right not to explain every scar. What mattered now was 4 days. They got back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and Coulter spent an hour riding the perimeter, which she understood as practical and not excessive, checking what was there, what was changed, what the night might have left behind. She used the time to copy out her notebook entries onto the spare paper she found in the supply shelf, making a second set of records, because one copy of something irreplaceable is the same as no copy at all. She wrapped the originals in oilcloth and put them in the tin box she'd found under the cot, and she put the copies in a separate place. Then she sat at the table and thought about what Calloway would do next. He had options. He could run, cut the operation, disappear before law arrived. That was the smart move, and she thought Calloway was smart enough to know it. But running meant leaving Pruitt and Silas Holden behind, and those two had enough local leverage to make Calloway's name very inconvenient in a lot of territories if they wanted to. Calloway might decide that cleaning up was worth more than running. Cleaning up meant her and Coulter. She was thinking about this when hooves came into the yard, not one horse, several. And she was at the window with the rifle before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Roy Deeks. 2 men she didn't know. And Marcus Holden, sitting his horse at the back of the group with the expression of a man who has been told to be somewhere and is deeply unhappy about it. Coulter came in from the perimeter at almost the same moment, which meant he'd heard them on the approach. He came through the back door and looked at the window, and she stepped aside so he could see. Deeks and 2, she said. Marcus is with them. He looked. Those 2 aren't deputies, they're Holden men. So Deeks brought backup that isn't his. Or the backup brought Deeks. They went out together. Roy Deeks sat his horse in the yard with his hand near his mustache and the expression of a man who has been maneuvered into a position he'd like to get out of. Coulter, he said, I've got a warrant. For what? Theft of private property. The warrant names the girl. He didn't look at Mara when he said it. He looked at a spot slightly to her left. I need to take her in. On whose complaint? Aldous Pruitt and Silas Holden. The name landed in the yard like something dropped from a height. She watched Coulter's face and saw nothing change in it, which was its own kind of statement. Silas himself, Coulter said. Yes. Deeks finally looked at Mara, and she saw in his face the discomfort of a man who is not entirely without conscience, but has learned to work around it. This doesn't have to be difficult, Coulter. She comes in, we sort it out through proper... What did she steal, Roy? Private documents, taken from a camp. Documents from a camp in Open Canyon country, used to run stolen cattle to a rail junction in Ridley. Coulter let that sit. That the theft you're talking about? Deeks' hand went to his mustache. I don't know anything about... Silas Holden's signature is in that ledger, Mara said. She kept her voice flat. Pruitt's is too. You come out here with a warrant signed by the same men whose names are in the evidence, Roy, and you expect us to think that's legal process? The 2 Holden men shifted in their saddles, She tracked the movement without moving her head. Deeks looked genuinely pained. "I have a warrant. A warrant from a compromised justice of the peace," Coulter said. "You know that." A long silence in the yard. The canyon wind came through and moved the dust, and nobody said anything for a stretch of time that made Mara count her own heartbeats. Then Marcus Holden rode forward from the back of the group. She hadn't expected that. Neither, from the slight adjustment in his posture, had Coulter. Marcus looked older than he had in the canyon. Whatever night he'd had, it had taken something from his face, not softened him exactly, but removed the performance of confidence that he usually wore. What was underneath was not admirable, but it was at least real. "This isn't going to work," Marcus said. He wasn't talking to Coulter or Mara. He was talking to the space in front of him, or to Roy Deeks, or to something none of them could see. "I told my father this morning it wasn't going to work. He didn't listen." Marcus, one of the Holden men, the older one, said it as a warning. "No!" Marcus looked at Mara. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's capacity for comfortable dishonesty, which was not a virtue he'd chosen so much as a limitation he'd been born with. "I knew the chain wasn't from our house. When I saw it in your pocket, I knew it wasn't ours. I used it anyway because Pruitt told me to. Told me we needed a reason to move you out of town before you figured out why you'd been set up." He stopped. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it." The yard was very quiet. "Marcus," the Holden man said again, harder. "Go back and tell my father I said it," Marcus said. "I don't care anymore." Deeks had his hand pressed flat against his mustache now, which she thought might be a new record. Mara looked at Marcus for a moment. She thought about what it cost him to say that. Not much, maybe, compared to what it cost her to stand in that street with rope on her wrists. But something. She wasn't going to thank him for it, but she wasn't going to dismiss it either. "Roy," Coulter said, "you want to serve that warrant knowing what you just heard?" Deeks looked at the warrant in his hand. He looked at Coulter. He looked at Marcus. He touched his mustache one more time. "I think," he said slowly, "there may be some procedural questions about this warrant that I need to look into before I can act on it." It was the most political sentence she'd ever heard. It was also, she understood, the most they were going to get from Roy Deeks today. And it was enough. "That's fine," Coulter said. "You go look into that." Deeks turned his horse. The two Holden men looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at them, with nothing in particular on his face. And then he turned his horse too, and they rode back toward the main road and Black Hollow and whatever was waiting for them there. She stood in the yard with Coulter and watched the dust settle. "3 more days," she said. "3 more days," he agreed. They were 3 of the longest days she'd experienced since the fever that had taken her mother, which was a comparison she didn't expect to make, but which was accurate. The waiting had a physical texture. She kept the rifle close. She checked the tin box 3 times a day, which was irrational, and she knew it. She slept in pieces. 2 hours. Wake. Listen. Sleep again. And she didn't complain about it because complaining wouldn't change the arithmetic of the situation. Coulter was quieter than usual, which was saying something. He worked during the days. The fence line, the East Slope water situation, the barn roof section that still needed attention, with the focused purposefulness of a man who understands that usefulness is a form of stability. She worked beside him. They didn't talk much, which was fine. She'd come to understand that the silence between them wasn't empty. It was the silence of 2 people who have established enough mutual understanding that they don't need to fill the air. On the second day, Calloway's men came. Not Calloway himself. 2 men she hadn't seen before, which meant he had more people than she'd counted, and she filed that away as a lesson about incomplete information. They came to the edge of the property and stopped there. Not crossing the fence line, just present, visible. She and Coulter stood on the porch and let them be visible. After 20 minutes, they left. "That was a message," she said. "Yeah, he's still here. Hasn't run yet. He's waiting to see if the marshal comes. And if the marshal doesn't, he'll try something more direct." Coulter looked at the road. "He needs that ledger." "He's not getting it." "No," Coulter said. "He's not." She believed it when he said it, and she thought that was interesting. The way certainty could transfer between people if the person carrying it was solid enough. She'd spent a long time being certain only of herself, and even then with reservations. It was a strange thing, trusting another person's certainty. She didn't love it, but she thought she could get used to it. Marshal Wren Holt rode in on the fourth day at noon with two deputies who looked like they'd been riding hard and didn't mind. Holt himself was not what she'd pictured from the telegram. She'd imagined someone in Coulter's mold, lean, weathered, the kind of contained. Holt was broad-shouldered and slightly rumpled, with a brown beard that needed attention and the eyes of someone who has been lied to professionally for 30 years and has developed very accurate calibration for it. He was maybe 50. He rode like a man who doesn't love riding, but does it because it's what the work requires. He dismounted in the yard and looked at Coulter with an expression that was complicated in ways she didn't have full context for. "Shaw," he said. "Holt," Coulter said. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific quality of men who share history they haven't got time to go into right now. Then Holt looked at Mara. "This the girl?" "Mara Vane," she said. "You've got a ledger with Pruitt's signature and Silas Holden's, and correspondence establishing the route and the buyer, and my observation notes, 6 weeks of them, with dates and descriptions, and a target list with Coulter's ranch on it." Holt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Coulter. "She always talk like that?" "Usually," Coulter said. "Good." Holt turned back to her. "Let me see it." She brought him inside and spread everything on the table, and she watched him go through it the way a serious person goes through evidence. Not fast, not impressed by it yet, just reading with the patience of someone who understands that the truth of a thing lives in the details and not the headline. He made small sounds occasionally. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise and relevant. He turned the ledger back twice to recheck entries. When he was done, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "All right," he said. "Here's how this goes. I'm going to ride into Black Hollow this afternoon. I'm going to present myself to Roy Deeks and inform him that his office is under federal oversight pending an investigation. I'm going to pick up Aldous Pruitt tonight. I'm going to send a wire to the Casper office to have someone waiting at the Ridley Junction." He looked at Mara. "Silas Holden is going to be harder. He has local relationships, and he's going to lawyer up before I get to him. It'll take longer. But it'll happen." He looked at the ledger, at Silas Holden's signature. "Yeah," he said, "it'll happen." "What about Calloway?" "I've got paper on Calloway from 2 other territories. He shows up in my jurisdiction. He's done." Holt stood. "Where's he operating from?" She told him about the canyon staging area. She showed him the map from the notebook. He studied it and asked 2 more questions, and she answered them, and then he folded the map and put it in his coat pocket. "Can I keep this?" "That's a copy," she said. "I have the original." He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. The same one Coulter had given her 6 weeks ago, the first time she'd shot a moving target. Like someone adjusting their expectations in a direction they hadn't anticipated. "Good thinking," he said. "I've been practicing." He rode for Black Hollow 2 hours later, deputies behind him. She and Coulter watched from the yard until the dust of them disappeared on the road south. The silence that followed was different from the waiting silence of the past 3 days. It had a different quality, not resolved exactly, but moving toward resolution, the way a storm feels different when it's leaving than when it's building. "It's not over yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the shape of it's changed." She thought about that. The shape of it. 3 days ago, she was the girl who'd stolen documents from a criminal camp and was dodging a fraudulent warrant. Today, she was the person who'd handed a territorial marshal enough evidence to dismantle the thing that had been built to destroy her. Same person, different position. The shape of things changed. That was worth knowing. Holt arrested Pruitt that evening. She heard about it 2 days later from the general store man in Black Hollow, who told it with the wide eyes of someone still recalibrating the order of his world. Pruitt had apparently maintained his smooth composure all the way through the reading of the charges, and had only broken when Holt put the ledger on the table and opened it to the page with his signature. Something in his face had changed then, the store man said, though he struggled to describe exactly what, like a building settling, was the closest he got. Silas Holden surrendered to Holt's office 6 days after that. Not dramatically, quietly, through a lawyer, with the particular bowed quality of a powerful man who has spent his power and is coming to terms with the account. Marcus was not charged. She didn't know exactly what conversation had led to that outcome, but she thought about what he'd said in the yard. I knew it was wrong when I did it. And she thought maybe that had been worth something after all. Not exoneration, but something. Calloway was picked up at the Ridley Junction, exactly as Holt had arranged. She heard that one without expression, which was not the same as not feeling it. 3 weeks after Holt's visit, she rode into Black Hollow. Coulter rode beside her. They came in from the North Road in the mid-morning, which meant the main street was awake and functioning, and the people on it had time to see them coming before they arrived. She was aware of being seen. She'd thought about whether that would bother her and had decided it wouldn't, and she'd been mostly right. Some faces in that street she recognized from the day she'd stood in the dust with rope on her wrists. Clement Greer was there, outside his stable. Della Foss near the dry goods. Others whose names she didn't know but whose faces she'd cataloged in that specific way you catalog the faces of people who looked away when you needed them to look. Nobody looked away now. She didn't feel triumph about that. She'd expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was something flatter and more permanent. The knowledge that she had been right about what was happening, that she had done something about it, and that she was still here. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, more than she'd been able to claim for most of the past 3 years. Holt met them at the sheriff's office. He'd been in Black Hollow for the better part of 2 weeks, untangling what needed untangling. He came out when he heard them ride up, and he looked at Mara with that direct, calibrated gaze. "Town council wants to make a formal statement," he said, "about the charges against you, clearing the record." "I'd like that in writing," she said. "Already done." He handed her a folded document. She opened it and read it. The legal language was dense, but the substance was clear. The charges arising from the complaint of Marcus Holden and subsequent complaints associated with the Holden and Pruitt matter were formally withdrawn, found to be without evidentiary basis and originating from parties now under federal indictment. Mara Vane, formerly of no fixed address, was to be considered without criminal record in this territory. No fixed address. She folded the document. "Thank you," she said. Holt nodded. He looked at Coulter. "You're a difficult man to predict, Shaw. I mean that as a compliment." "Take it however it fits," Coulter said. Holt went back inside. A door opened somewhere on the street. The saloon, the broken shutter clapping against the frame the way it always did. And then the main street of Black Hollow went back to being a main street, doing what main streets do, which was pretend that what had just happened was ordinary. She sat on the horse and looked at the document in her hand and thought about a few things at once, which was a habit she'd developed out of necessity and hadn't managed to lose. She thought about being 14 and alone in a town not much different from this one, sleeping in doorways and eating what she could find, telling herself that the situation was temporary because the alternative to believing that was too heavy to carry. She thought about the crowd in this same street 2 months ago and the specific loneliness of standing in it. She thought about Coulter Shaw riding up that day on a gray horse and cutting her loose without asking for proof or permission, which was, she still didn't entirely know what it was. Not rescue, exactly. More like a refusal to participate in a particular cruelty, and the decision, made quickly and without ceremony, to do something different. The thing about Coulter, she'd come to understand, was that he was not a man who fixed things. He didn't fix her, and he hadn't tried. He'd given her tools and time and the specific dignity of being treated like someone whose capabilities were real and worth developing. The rest she'd done herself. She needed to know that. It mattered, knowing that. "You thinking about staying?" Coulter asked. He was looking at the street, not at her. She looked at the document in her hand, then at the canyon country visible above the roofline to the north. The red rock, the high walls, the vast and complicated landscape she'd learned to move through over the past 2 months. "For a while," she said. He nodded once. "The south route still needs better mapping," she said. "And your east slope water situation isn't actually fixed. You've just been managing it." "I know. And I want to ride more of the territory before the weather turns." "That makes sense." She looked at him. He was still looking at the street, and there was something in his profile. In the weathered, unglamorous, complicated face of a man who had done things and carried them and come out the other side still upright, that she thought was the closest thing she'd found in a long time to the idea of a home. Not a place. A quality. The quality of being around someone who doesn't require you to be less than you are in order to be comfortable. She put the document inside her coat, next to the notebook and the spare copies of the evidence she still hadn't stopped carrying. She didn't know when she'd stop carrying them. Maybe when it stopped feeling like something that needed to be protected. Maybe when she trusted that the things she'd built couldn't be taken the same way they'd been threatened. That would take time. She was 17 years old, not naive enough to think otherwise. They rode back north out of Black Hollow together, and she didn't look back this time either, but for a different reason than before. Before, she hadn't looked back because she couldn't stand to watch something she'd already lost. Now she didn't look back because what was ahead was more interesting. The canyon country opened up ahead of them. The red rock and the scrub and the long flat light of the late morning, the kind of landscape that doesn't care about you, doesn't offer comfort or threat on its own, just is, with the vast indifference of things that have been there longer than any human trouble. She'd come to love that about it. It asked nothing of her. It simply existed and required her to be capable inside it. And being capable inside it turned out to be something she was very good at. She rode at a pace that felt right, not performing anything for anyone, just moving through the territory on a horse she'd borrowed long enough that it was starting to feel like hers. She thought about the notebook, about the maps she hadn't drawn yet, about the south route that needed better documentation and the east slope that needed a real solution, and the shooting practice she hadn't done in 3 days because the past 3 days had contained other priorities. She thought about what Roy Deeks would do now that the people who'd been managing him were gone, whether he'd become something better or something worse without the weight of them, which was a question she genuinely didn't know the answer to. She thought about Marcus Holden, who was living somewhere with the knowledge of what he'd done and what he'd finally admitted, which she imagined was an uncomfortable way to exist. She hoped it stayed uncomfortable for him, not out of malice, but because comfortable men who've done wrong things tend to drift back toward the shape of the wrong thing. Discomfort, in the right measure, was a teacher. She'd learned that herself. Coulter's ranch came into view below the long slope. The dark timber house, the repaired barn, the flat-roofed outbuilding, the corral where the young horses moved in the morning light. It wasn't beautiful in the way that photographs are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful when they're honest about what they are. She'd done her share of building that honesty. 2 months of fence line and barn roofs and water problems and shooting practice had earned her a stake in the place, not by deed or paper, but in the way that actually mattered, in the hours. She rode down the slope into the yard and dismounted and took the horse to the barn because that's what you did when you came home. You took care of what carried you. She was 17 years old. She had a notebook full of things she'd learned to see. She had a name, not the one they'd tried to give her in that street, not the thief's name, not the drifter's name, just her own name, which she'd kept through everything and which now meant something different than it had before, because she was different, and names are only as solid as the person carrying them. She had, for the first time in 3 years, somewhere to be. She hung up the saddle and went to find what needed doing next.